Okay, today I have the great pleasure of getting to talk to somebody new. Her name's Jill Fraser. She's somebody that was introduced to me by the friends and family over on Facebook. So thanks all for that. I did a drive-by on her website, and there were so many areas of interest that we share, and so I was really looking forward to having a chat. I reached out, she was into it, and so we're off and running. So with that, I will introduce you to Jill Fraser. Jill, how are you?
Hi.
Hi. Thanks so much
Good.
for
Happy to
taking
be here. Thanks so
yeah.
much.
Thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to talk. I really appreciate it. Why don't we start off by having you give us a quick overview of the work that you do?
Well, I'm a composer. I've written music my entire life, and pretty much everybody's probably heard me because I've done literally hundreds of TV commercials. But my main focus has always been electronic music. That's my instrument. I have a big Serge modular. I worked at Serge and I went to CalArts. And I'm currently not doing so many commercials anymore. I'm kind of retired from that and I'm focusing on my own experimental, I guess that's what most people call it, electronic music.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to kind of watch some of the performance work that you had put up on your website, which is jillfrasermusic.com. I'll have it on the show notes for people to check out. But it was really interesting to see, first of all, you don't see that many people taking their surge out into the wild. So that was pretty cool to see. But also, it was great to see you doing the kind of work that you were doing. I thought it was beautiful, but I also found it to be very compositional in a way that a lot of times you don't hear in electronic, in particularly in live modular based music. It was really composition heavy, which I think is a nod to the work that you've done there.
You're not the first person to say that. I tend to not think about it too much, but people tend to describe it as very compositional or cinematic.
Right.
I guess that's just kind of where I live. I've been currently doing some performances with Peter Grenader, occasionally with Chaz Smith. We have this little group we call the zZyzx Society, which is basically a way for us to play our compositions and then get other people to play along with us.
Right.
So we've been doing those things. Yeah, I think that I have a lot of experience doing film scores and of course TV stuff. So I tend to think that music needs to start here and take you someplace.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so that's kind of what it sounds like, I guess.
Right.
I'm not trying to tell a story. It's more like architecture. I'm kind of like building a building for you to explore, I guess.
Right. Maybe when I talk about it being compositional, that's what I'm hearing is sort of like the development of structure in a pretty deliberate way.
Yeah, I think so. I think, gosh, I'm not real good at talking about it, but I do kind of. It's not like I necessarily plan out a structure ahead of time,
Right.
but I think that I do have. I'm not like looking at, okay, I'm going to write a piece that's in this form. I don't think about
Right.
it that way.
Right. Right.
But at some point, a structure starts to appear, and then you kind of have to follow it and build it up and make the walls and make sure that you're going on a voyage,
Sure.
and you want a beginning, something exciting to happen in the middle, and some kind of a respite at the end.
Now you mentioned that you perform primarily on a large surge system. What does large mean to you?
Well, you know what? I do take my Serge out, but recently I've been taking it out less, and I have a small one panel Serge that Dimitri Bronson up in San Francisco built for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've been taking the laptop, and I've got a push two, and
Right.
and taking those out because I do need to have that structure. I do perform live with the big Surge, but honestly, it's getting kind of old, and there's always something that's coming loose or not quite right, and And I just can't quite tolerate the risk of things going horribly, horribly wrong. I feel too much responsibility to all the people who are sitting there listening.
Right. Well, I hear that, and I used to have an 8-panel surge system, which I loved,
Yeah,
but it
yeah,
was it was some of the panels were quite old. It was starting to get cranky, right? And the problem is I
yep.
don't have the electronic chops to do any of the work myself.
Yeah, there was a time when I could do it myself, but not anymore.
Yeah, right.
I don't want to take the time to do that. It's a whole thing in itself to get into that. So yeah, Rex Probe or Kevin Berhaney does that stuff, or Dimitri up in San Francisco. Yeah, keeping it all up and running. And I've been doing a lot of, or a few performances out in the desert, and some of them are off road. And so hearing it bounce around in the back of the car kind of makes me upset. So,
Oh, I can hear that, right? Oh my God, that's
yeah,
terrifying just to even think
yeah,
about
yeah,
it.
it's a little upsetting. So the little one panel is easy to take, and that seems to be. I do a lot of sampling of my Serge at home, so I I'm going with that.
Well, you mentioned that you have a push too, which pretty well implies you're using Ableton on these performances too. How much of what you're doing is sourced directly from the live surge, and how much is like stuff that you kind of format and prepare ahead of time?
Oh, to be honest, I'd say that easily three-quarters is prepared ahead of time,
Okay.
and then the live surge for both processing and then things that are not particularly time sensitive.
Hmm.
I love the way my surge sounds. I love the oscillators. I've got a ton of oscillators, and I everything that analog sound. But when it comes to clocks and sequences and tempos, the computer does it really, really well.
You're right.
So,
Well, but I think it's interesting
so yeah,
because, frankly, a lot of people want to pretend that they don't use the computer, but they do. And I'm glad to hear you kind of talk specifically about this because it points to something else, which is that you can have prepared material and still be really improvisational in performance, right? And I
yes,
think maybe one of
yeah,
the reasons that I gravitated towards to live when it first came out was that clip view sort of was a way that engaged me in sort of a performative way of working with material. Is that what
yeah.
has you as well? Is that how you work?
Yes, yeah, that's the obvious. Well, to me, it seems like the obvious reason for using Ableton.
Right.
For most of my compositional life, I've been a digital performer person,
Oh, really?
and I love digital performer. I used it since the very first version of it. The ability to print out parts for musicians to play was a big was real important to me. It was
Hmm.
fast and easy for me to quickly print out a ton of parts, and that implementation was just really really important. So, but then Ableton, of course, the clip view
Yeah.
and the push is really an instrument in itself. I really like I like that. I like that I don't have to use a computer keyboard for everything, and I
Right.
can play this instrument, the push, which at this stage of the game to have this new instrument to learn is really cool. I like it.
Yeah, yeah. So, with the Surge, it sounds like, you were kind of hands-on with Surge creation way back. How long have you had the system? You talk about this larger system that you have. How long have you had that? And has it changed much over the years? Or did you get it and it's become like your cello?
Yeah, when I got out of CalArts, a group of us went to work at Surges in Hollywood,
Hmm.
and we would take as much money as I needed to live on at the time, or a little bit of money to live on, and then take all the rest of our hours in gear. And so that's when I got my Surge.
Oh,
And
okay.
I've had like a ton of other synthesizers in addition to that over the years. I had a lot of Oberheim gear because I was friends with Anne Graham, who worked at Oberheim, and so I would know about everything new that was coming out. Yeah, so I had like a ton of other gear, but the Surge is well, I actually had a Moog 3P at one point. It belonged to a composer that I worked with, Jack Nietzsche. I don't know if you know who he is. He's quite
Yeah.
an infamous film composer, and
Uh-huh.
he really gave me my big break in films. And he had a Moog 3P, and I had that for quite a while. That he wasn't using it. I can tell you a weird story about that 3P. I took it apart because some of the pots were dirty, and I was going to try to clean it up. And it's the 3P that was in a movie that the Rolling Stones were in called Performance.
Yeah.
And I took the back off of this thing, and there were a bunch of like little wads of gum with birthday candles that were half burnt stuck in the back of the modules. Wild, huh?
Of course. It makes perfect sense somehow.
Yeah,
That's
and it was the
wild.
movie. I mean, you can see in that old movie, you can see the that 3P in
Right.
there, and
Well,
it
so
was that one.
maybe that's how, for the movie, that's how they lit up the lights. They couldn't actually figure out how to run it. So they figured, well, maybe if
That's
some
the only.
lights shine out of the jacks, that'll be cool.
That's the only thing that I can figure. It was,
Right.
regular little birthday candles, half burnt,
That's
stuck in little wads of
hilarious.
gum.
Unbelievable. That's funny. That's funny. So tell me a little bit about your work in television commercials, your commercial work. That's one of the things I noticed from your site is the list of commercial clients you have is remarkable in its length, right? You've done a lot of work on commercials.
Yeah, I've been really really lucky because I've never done anything to make money other than write music. So that in itself was incredibly lucky,
No
and
kidding.
most of that money came from TV commercials, and I've probably done like three or four hundred that have gone to air. The first 3 years that Lexus was launched, I did all of the spots for Lexus. I did a lot of BMW. For a long time, I did just tons and tons of cars.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of car brands on there.
Yeah, and oddly enough, well, mostly luxury import cars. My first big car spot was Porsche, which I did for Chiat Day, and I did several Porsche spots for them. And they were very electronic. They were all Surge. Yeah, they were just completely electronic. And gosh, that had to be back probably like around 1980,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even earlier. And yeah, because Porsche doesn't do TV anymore. And then some of the producers from there, in particular Francesca Cohn, went to Saatchi and Saatchi, and then when Saatchi and Saatchi opened up Team One to deal with Lexus, she brought me in on Lexus, and we did all
Interesting.
those spots.
Yeah, what was it about your work that drew them in? I mean,
Oh, it was the electronics for sure. It was
the
the
gloss of it.
modular stuff.
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
wondering
the
about.
drive. It was all very this sort of driving, repetitive thing. It was not Philip Glass, but it was very repetitive sequencer based stuff.
I see. Okay.
And I personally think it went great with cars because its motion, its drive, it's also sits under a voiceover very well.
Right.
So then there was that. But then with commercials, what's really, really cool is that you do lots and lots of different styles. And because, I had a big classical music background, I could pick up pretty much any style.
Mm-hmm.
So, and plus you have a nice budget so you can hire like whoever you want to play on stuff. So like if I had something that was required blues, which isn't necessarily my milieu, I could call Paul Butterfield and have him come in and play.
Right.
So
Right.
you never got bored, that's for sure.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, I ended up doing a lot of cars, and I think it was mostly the electronic stuff. And then I did a bunch of like health spa stuff, valleys, all things that require a lot of motion
Mm-hmm.
and drive.
Yeah, I've never really thought about it, but it does make sense. If I just think about it in the context of cars, I mean, there's a lot about a sequencer that parallels the way like an internal combustion engine works, I guess.
Yeah.
But also the idea of like flying past, because they always seem to be like driving through like semi-desert or something. So you're always
Yep.
flashing past like tumbleweeds and stuff. And there's a lot of
Yeah.
visuals that match up with the sequence track. I can see it.
Yeah. 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 I think it goes really well. So I really enjoy doing those spots.
So I'm kind of curious if you were doing these kind of things back in the 80s, in the early 80s, and maybe even late 70s. This certainly predates the time when home studios were common.
Oh yeah, I didn't do anything in studios. Yeah, I
Right.
practically lived at Village Recorders.
Oh, okay. All right. I was
Yeah,
wondering where
yeah.
you did your work and how often did you actually work with other musicians, or was it sort of like a solitary sit in the room and tweak on it until it came together?
I feel like I really made a point of I would do my electronic tracks, and I would often send those in as part of the demos. And then we'd go in, and I would every possible opportunity bring players in to play on top of them. So I mean, why not? I had the budget, and LA's full of the best players in the world. Why would I miss this opportunity?
Right.
So I would bring in, like Jim Keltner played on a bunch of spots for me. How lucky and amazing is
Oh
that?
my God. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I had these great guys come in all the time and play over my electronic stuff. That was what I thought of as my sound.
Very interesting. Now, the other thing I noticed on your site that I'm really curious about uh, is that it says you toured with Buffy Sainte Marie,
Yeah.
which at first blew me away because I just think of her as a folkie, right? But I actually was like, I was so curious. I went and I just like typed in uh, Buffy Sainte Marie electronic music, and it turns out that she feels like she has been doing electronic music since forever. I had no idea.
I met her because of Jack Nietzsche, and I was working on. She was working on a movie called Spirit of the Wind,
Hmm.
which was about the dog races in Alaska. I got to know her. She heard some of my stuff, and her kind of powwow Indian singing over those electronic tracks. It was so much fun to do that, and I think it sounded great. She thought it sounded great, and so I did a little bit of touring with her, which was, real exciting for me, of course. That would have been early '80s,
Okay.
and I brought the Serge with me to Europe for that, and to Canada for that.
Wow.
Yeah, and we had to have transformers and stuff for it,
Right.
and yeah, yeah. I have a gigantic road case for my Serge,
Yeah, you
which
must.
most people don't have. It's a gigantic anvil case.
I don't know though. I've seen enough bad images. For some reason, I have this propensity when I fly into a city, and as my plane taxis up to the gate, I make the mistake of looking out the window at the people in the plane next door dropping stuff out of the compartment,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
luggage
I know.
compartment. And I've seen it happen enough that I'm like, I'm never putting an instrument in there. It's just very scary to me.
I know. I know.
Crazy.
I had racks of outboard gear, and I would always get like the 2 inches of foam all the way around,
Right.
so that and so the road cases. And I don't know what to do with them. I have just enormous road cases.
Uh-huh.
I have a whole big storage space dedicated to them.
Wow. So when you were touring with Buffy, what kind of work was it? Were you doing? Were you just like putting together sequences that she would play and sing over, or was
Yeah,
it part of a and or was it
basically.
part of a bigger group scenario?
A couple of times we went out with a band, but then I would have my pieces that I did with her, and they would be sort of the same kind of sequencer stuff. Um, yeah, the same kind of sequencer stuff uh, that I was doing on commercials.
Sure.
Very
Interesting.
similar.
Yeah.
And then I would also play some keyboard parts, but I have to admit I'm not the world's greatest keyboard player. So ultimately, she ended up needing more keyboards, and I was also doing too well with the commercials to
Right.
be able to afford to go out with
To
her anymore.
drive around the country or drive around Canada, I guess, right? So
Yeah.
I'm curious. We've talked already. We've touched on a few things. You mentioned that you did film scoring and film work. You did all this work as a composer and performer on commercials. You toured with people doing stuff, and you're currently actively a performer. Where do you come from? Where did you get sort of like both? And it's kind of like a two-pronged thing. Where did you get the knowledge to do the things that you're doing? But also, what in your background kind of put you in a spot to feel comfortable and like maybe confident enough to put yourself in a position to do this stuff? I find it fascinating.
Well, I started piano when I was little, when I was like 5 years old, and the piano teacher that I had was this wonderful woman, Mrs. Gosling, who had been a piano player in silent movie theaters. She was actually teaching my mother, and she would bring these coloring books, but they were coloring books where you colored in notes. There were, staffs and notes, and I'd sit there and color while
Mm-hmm.
my mother was taking a piano lesson. And then I was simultaneously, I guess I got a horrible ear infection and my hearing shut down until they removed my adenoids. And when they did that, I guess I became a big pain in the neck about wanting piano lessons. I think what must have happened is that I lost the ability to hear, and then I got it back suddenly, and I was fascinated with sound at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And she had me with these coloring books, and she'd always had me write down music as well. And so it never occurred to me that you didn't write music too. It just seemed part of the whole thing. And at the same time I was learning how to read words, so it just was like another language. It was just, we read and we did music, and you write music. And so it never occurred to me that this was something unusual or at all. It just seemed real natural. So I always wrote music ever since I was little. And then I was at Girl Scouts, and somebody brought in a copy of Switched on Bach.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like the light switch went off, as I know it did for a whole bunch of other people too. I was totally taken. And then it wasn't long after that, since I had been writing music I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and one of the college professors at the university there heard some stuff that I wrote, and he said, "Why don't you come and audition and sit in on some of my classes?" And that was Roger Hannay. And so I did. And at that point, I heard Silver Apples and Wild Bull, and I was just smitten. I just couldn't believe my ears. I had to do that. I was so taken with the panning that I just couldn't contain myself. So I kind of probably stalked Morton Subotnik every time he came to the East Coast, and he brought me out to go to CalArts. So that's how that happened. And I was he was my mentor, and then I was his teaching assistant. And then when I got out, I worked a little bit on Cloudless Sulfur, doing control tracks. And so I got a real up close look at Mort in composing, which is, how you really learn how to be a composer is by watching another composer.
Right.
And then Mort got a call from Warner Brothers. They wanted somebody to bring synthesizer over to work with Jack Nietzsche. Jack Nietzsche wanted somebody, and Mort didn't want to do it, and he sent me, and I took the boucle from CalArts over there and worked on a movie called Hardcore, which starred George C. Scott.
Right.
And then I worked on a whole bunch of different movies with Jack. I worked on one called When You Coming Back, Red Ryder. There was a bunch of different movies and different sessions that I did with Jack. And so that it was just sort of natural. It didn't occur to me that it was at all anything unusual to do. but apparently that did occur to some other people.
No doubt. Well, and then how did you get your first breaks into doing the commercial work?
Oh, we went on strike. Okay, with Jack, of course, all of that was all union. I joined the
Mm-hmm.
union, which was fantastic, which was great. But I'm a proud union musician now, and we went on strike. And I was walking the picket line with a friend, and we kind of hashed this plan to make up a bunch of fake commercials. I mean, we weren't fooling anybody. We just made up 30 seconds of commercials and sent it around to advertising agencies, and yeah, and then got stuff from there. Of course, I had some film credits at that point, and I had an agent.
Mm-hmm.
I had a film agent because I had picked up some film credits.
Right.
So yeah, so that's what happened then. But it was because we couldn't do movie scores, and we were walking the picket line over at Warner Brothers.
It's hilarious how the few times that there were strikes, how often that represented changes not only in, I mean, it represented changes first of all in just how things were done, but how often that had a huge impact on people's lives and the work that they did. Oftentimes there'd be
Yeah.
a strike and all of a sudden there'd be a whole new generation of composers crop up because they either, played scab roll or they got to know other people while they were walking the line, or like in your case,
Uh-huh.
they just ended up doing stuff in order to fill up the time, and it ended up being the reel that got them work. It seems like those
Yeah.
strikes are
Yeah.
actually pretty powerful ways of shaking things up.
Well, yeah, I think that musicians, just because you can't work for some reason or another, you're still making music. It's not like you stop doing it. So
Right.
that music's got to go someplace. Something's got to happen.
Yeah, true enough.
So I think that's what happens. And usually it's music that you make that's not for a job that's the most creative and gets you the next job.
hmm Through all this stuff, the education that you got in Chapel Hill probably built up sort of like the basics of music theory and stuff like that. Where did you learn sort of like the composition and organizational skills necessary to be an actual composer? Because it's a big difference from learning some theory to being a composer. And even watching Morton,
Oh,
that's one thing, but there's a lot of details you have to learn along the way, right?
yeah, I think that started with Roger Hannay at UNC because I would bring in my compositions and we'd work on those. And then I did some undergraduate work at East Carolina with Otto Henry, and that was, composition teaching. He was teaching
Right.
me composition then. And then, of course, with Mort at CalArts. And I studied a little bit with Mel Powell at CalArts, orchestration. I think mostly the orchestration, I learned orchestration with Mel Powell, and on my own with the Ken Keenan book, I just, hunkered down and figure it out. But also following scores and looking at scores with Roger Hannay and Otto Henry. They had
Interesting.
me study a lot of scores.
And how much technology? Because again, this is, since you were doing a lot of your work in the studio, was it still kind of on your head to learn a lot of the technology for like doing sync to video or sync to film, or were there technicians that handled that stuff?
Well, that's a good question, because when I got out of CalArts and I started working on films, which was of course thanks to Mort getting me that
Mm-hmm.
first job over at Warner Brothers, I realized that I did not understand sync to film, and I didn't understand click tracks, and so there was a course offered over at Tadeo on engineering and film tracks. And so I go down to Tadeo every Tuesday night or whenever it was. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I completed those classes there. So I had not gotten that. It was, I didn't want to look like an idiot in the studio. So
Right.
I found a way to do that. So, and
Yeah.
that it couldn't be a better place. I mean, Tadeo was a legendary film scoring stage. So it couldn't have been a better opportunity. And then I saw sessions, and there were composers who let me come and sit in their sessions and just watch and see how it all happened.
Yeah. Well,
Elmer Bernstein once let me come and sit in, and
wow.
Henry Mancini let me come and sit in, and so there were a lot of people that really, would let me come and watch.
But how did you get the introduction to him? I mean, it's not like Henry Mancini's like sitting at a Starbucks and you say, "Hey, Henry, can I come watch a session?" You
Oh
know?
no, you know what happened with him was, I also took a class, and this was after CalArts, I took a class in film scoring at UCLA because I was trying to fill in the technique, just the mechanics of film scoring. And so he showed up as a speaker at this class at UCLA. And he says he's talking about how he did a piece for some film where he has two pianos out of tune, and he says how and I, being a smart ass, chirped up, "Oh, well, Charles Ives did that." And he was
Oh.
so kind and so gracious, and actually wrote me a letter afterwards saying, that I was right, and how he was so charming and so gracious. And then that opened the door to having conversation, and I saw him. I saw him in different places around town, and finally, he let me come and sit in and hang, and he was just the most gracious, nicest guy. And then I went back to CalArts, and I was on a panel with him and me, and it was like the seasoned professional and the young newcomer.
Oh,
So it was very
that's
cool.
awesome. That's really cool. What a great opportunity. It's curious because I think one of the things that people don't necessarily understand about a place like LA, or New York is like this, London's kind of like this, now Berlin's getting to be like this, is that by being there are a million opportunities just under the surface. And if you have, again, enough confidence to kind of just like dive in, you'll find you'll find opportunities to interact with people that, when you talk about it later, seem like they were, magical or at least improbable, right? But that's kind of what these environments provide.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that, I never even thought of myself as having any confidence to speak of, but I was really curious, and I just really wanted to know. So if you poke around enough, and then plus once I got an agent, the agent would send me out to different studios and stuff to meet people, and then once I was on the lot someplace, I'd go poking my nose into different rooms.
Well, but see there again,
Why
I mean,
wouldn't you?
well,
Right?
I know you say that, except for a lot of people, it's sort of like, we were all taught to keep, stay within lines, keep our arms inside of the car windows, all those kind of things, and you have to be a little bit of a rule breaker to put yourself in those kind of positions.
Yeah, or to be stupid enough to not even know that there are rules.
Well, that's possible too, right? Good point. Good point. But I just think of you as the way that you weave your story, you do it in a very kind of like a laid back way, but going all the way back to being just a young kid who didn't know that you weren't supposed to be able to write music, so you're doing it, and somehow this music tumbles into the lap of quite a renowned composition teacher. I mean, that that doesn't happen to wallflowers. It really doesn't. It's an amazing opportunity, and it's interesting to hear that it happened, but you also then took advantage of the opportunity. I think that's what a lot of people forget, is that not only does the opportunity have to present itself, but you have to take advantage of it too, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think if you want to, you just, what's the old saying? I've been terrified my entire life, but I never let it stop me from doing anything I really wanted to do.
Right. Nice. Yeah. Yeah. So did you ever get in way over your head?
I suppose so, but never. Yeah, I think so, but you just kind of keep working away at it until you solve the problem to the best of your ability.
So, like, what's one of the worst things? I mean, just kind of like, in your, if you delve into your reptile brain, what's something that you got yourself into that scared you a little bit? I did some studio work in the past, and I remember one time getting into a gig that was way in over my head, right? And there was
Yeah,
like
yeah,
some
that's yeah.
terror in that I'll never actually shake.
Yeah, yeah. I anything involving actually playing what would require some real serious piano chops. There have been times when I've been on a gig that really was for that. They said they wanted synthesizer, but they really wanted somebody to play something
Hmm.
that really required some chops and like jazz improvisational chops, which I really
Uh-huh.
don't have.
Right.
And yeah, there have been some times exactly what you just said, where you're on a studio session, and you realize that, oh no, they really don't want you to make bleeps and bloops and make that sampler go, make the sequencer. What they really want you is to play a bunch of jazz chords,
Yeah,
and
they
that's
want you
like,
to be Herbie
yikes.
Hancock, right? Yeah.
Right? Yeah,
Gee,
yeah,
thanks.
yeah. And yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, there have been times when that has come up, but fortunately, I didn't end up doing a lot of those kind of sessions. But then, when I was composing as a commercial composer, that's when you know how to make the right call and get the right player in there.
Well, and that's where you're talking before about if you find yourself in a position to have the budget to do it, why the hell wouldn't you, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely,
That
yeah.
must have been amazing. So there's one other thing I wanted to ask about because you mentioned something. This is yet another one of these lines that resonates with me personally because I experienced this context switch. And you mentioned that you heard switched on Bach and that turned your head onto something. But it was hearing Wild Bull and Silver Apple that really lit you on fire, right?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah,
And I think it's an interesting interplay because I think a lot of people, from a synthesis standpoint, they heard switched on Bach, and for them, it was like synthesizers are great for doing emulative, emulative kinds of sounds, and you could use it for these compositional purposes, right? And maybe,
yeah,
and that goes down one track, and then there are a certain much smaller group of people that hear silver apples and it's like that flexible fluid timing, those
yeah,
intricate otherworldly timbres. These are the things that speak to me far more than a fugue ever could. Did you ever find yourself, I mean, that is such a big mental jump. And I'm curious about, you would have found yourself in a position to sometimes kind of have to go back and sort of like say, well, yeah, but I need to pull, I need to pull a Wendy Carlos out of my hat for this gig, instead of my, instead of my Wild Bull emulation, right? Did you ever find yourself questioning that shift, or was that such a part of your internal voice that was always the obvious line for you?
I think there's two things. One is like more to me, his sounds, those pieces sound so musical and so orchestral that it's not a very big jump, say from a Ravel or Scriabin into Silver Apples and Wild Bull. Sonically, if you just,
Mm-hmm.
close your eyes, I mean, you have these huge sweeps and stuff, say in levels that are also there in Wild Bull. I mean, these big timbral gestures. So musically, that's all kind of in a line to me. That all goes from one to the next thing. Then the other thing is going back to the Wendy Carlos stuff. What was so exciting about Switched on Bach to me was not just the timbres, but the speed. and
Yeah.
just this manic uh, uh, interpretation, which was the same thing that I loved about Glenn Gould. Was also here, it was on steroids with Wendy Carlos. So they're all sort of part of the whole sonic timeline. Like there are musical things that appeal to me every single time, and they are in those pieces. Whether it's the speed, whether it's these big swoops and big, these big crescendos. I mean, they just work.
Thanks for helping me out of that. I feel like I kind of talked myself in a weird corner, maybe. So our time is getting close to done here. I can't believe it. But before I let you go, I do want to ask or talk a little bit about your current performance work. Again, one of the nice things is you provided some audio and video excerpts, including a video of you and Peter working as the what do you call it? The zZyzx Society? Is that it?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah. I wasn't sure how to pronounce that because it had way too many Z's and not enough vowels, but I'll go
I
with
think
that.
zZyzx is actually correct. We've been
It's
calling it the zZyzx Society,
oh,
but
okay.
as I've read more about zZyzx and what it really is, I believe zZyzx is
Oh
correct.
wow. First of all, it's an interesting interplay that you have doing that because it's two people deeply engrossed in their modular stuff, which I always tease people that talk about doing duet or ensemble work with modular synths because something a friend of mine once said was that a synthesizer can make all the sound. You can fill up 100% of the frequency spectrum. And so having two people with that capability has the potential for being a train wreck, right? When you're working with Peter,
Yeah.
what do you do? How do you interact? How do you communicate in a way that makes for a useful and a musical performance? I always love kind of pinging people on this because I think that I'm just curious about how it's done, how you approach it.
Well, you've asked a question that's really perfect because this is, I mean, Peter might argue with me about this, but you're totally right. It definitely can be a train wreck. My personal way of looking at this is that Peter is more doing the free form modular stuff, and my side of it is much more structured and much more based in the computer. And I see myself as providing a compositional structure and generally more rhythmic stuff, more things that have to do with form, things that are going to be consistent from performance to performance. And he's providing more analog, of course, with all of his modules that he's made, and he's really good on his machine. So I feel like there's a rough division of labor that, in my mind, helps to keep that train wreck from happening.
Sure. Now, I noticed on one of the video pieces that you had that you actually had a harpist was
Yes,
working with you. How often do
right,
you
right.
inter- How often do you do work where you're interfacing with like acoustic musicians? So I always think that the
You know,
combination is really wonderful, but it's also sometimes hard to get, especially like traditional musicians, to sit down with somebody who looks like they're working a telephone, an old style telephone console.
yeah, we have one or two pieces that we feel like lend themselves very well to having another performer come in, and what is seems to be working at the moment is that we have somebody different come in for each performance. We've had Catherine Redless come in and play harp. The next time we did that same piece, Jennifer Irvine played cello on it. Peter's friend Danny Carey's a drummer from Tool. He's done some tracks on it for our record. We've got different people who come in, but it's not every piece in the program. It's just one or two pieces that we add somebody in. But I personally, going back to the commercials, to have somebody come in and play and leave some space in the piece for them that is really, really, really good. I like that.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting that you say that. I think that some people have a desire to blast to the front of the stage, right? But
Yeah.
my friend Andrew talks about he's a really amazing jazz saxophone player, and he said that from his perspective, oftentimes the best groups that he played with were the people where everybody was very subtly trying to move to the back of the stage, right? And
Oh,
there's something about that process
yeah,
where you're
yeah,
specifically opening up spots for other people lends itself to really great ensemble play, right?
yeah, yeah. Well, and if you have somebody like on a commercial, say you have a Paul Butterfield who is willing to come in and play, you don't want to tell him too much what to do. You want him to bring what he brings to the party, to your party, right?
Right, exactly.
So that's what I hope to do when we do these performances. I hope to have people come in and bring something to the party, and leave space for them to do that.
So now that you're moving out of the commercial game and stuff like that, what are you working on now, and what are some of the future things that we can expect to hear from you?
I've always written music. I apparently am not going to stop writing music. So if it's just me out in the middle of the desert playing music for the coyotes, that's fine. There's just a whole bunch of stuff that I need to hear. So I'm going to have to just write it, and if there's an audience, fine. If there's not, fine. Every once in a while, I have this piece of property out in the desert, out in Joshua Tree, and I've gone out there in the middle of the night with my laptop and my Bluetooth speakers and played stuff that I've written specifically for the desert out there in the middle of the night all by myself, and it's like one of the best musical experiences I've ever had. It's just like, it sounds great, and I hope somebody else hears it, but I don't know if anybody's listening.
Well, boy, that sounds like an amazing experience, though. I just kind of like shot me to feeling that. I can totally imagine what that's like.
No, it's like I've never ever stopped writing music my whole life. So at this age, I don't have any illusions of creating growing an audience. But it's like, if you have a bunch of flowers lying on the table, you don't just leave them there to wilt. You pick them up and put them in a vase
Right.
and arrange them a little bit, and that's kind of like what music is like. There's all this sound, and you just gotta pick it up and put it in the vase and arrange it. And if somebody sees it, that's just great.
Well, Jill, I want to thank you so much for the time. This was just a wonderful talk and very inspiring.
Um,
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
well, thank you for having me, and this is you make it easy.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, with that, then I will let you have the rest of your day. Thank you so much, and have a good one.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Well, many thanks to Jill for spending the time talking. It was really great to get a chance to catch up with her, find out what all she's been doing, as well as what her background was. Pretty interesting stuff. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for sticking with me. Next week is magic number 200. And so it's hard to believe that we've already gotten this far, but couldn't have done it without y'all. So thanks for showing up every week. I really appreciate it. With that, I'll let you go. Have a good one.